This is it, folks. The final episode of Comic Book Corner. Maybe. Hit-wise, I've been doing better than average with this series. So if I get some actual comments, say more than 3, I might reconsider making this just a 4-episode miniseries. Maybe, like a lot of my favorite miniseries from the 80s and 90s, this one gets a regular series after it's done. But even if it does come back, it's not going to be this listicle format. That's sort of lazy, and I've done pretty much all I can think of to do with it. So even if it comes back, it's going to be very, very different. The best example of the type of show I would like to turn this into is, well, Steve Shives' Trek Actually, where he takes an issue about the real world and applies it to Star Trek. And I think there's a lot more potential in that with comic books than there is in just these clickbaity top 10 lists. But anyway, for this episode, as promised, I'm doing the top 5 worst licensed books I've ever read and the top 10 best. I've been a regular comic book reader since 1988. I've seen a lot of these licensed books come and go, and most of them are god-awful. Not like now, when you'll occasionally get people who were involved in the series in some capacity as a writer or editor on the series. That was really rare back then. You would get Steve Perry on Thundercats or Silverhawks, or Larry Hama on G.I. Joe. But it didn't really happen that often. Most licensed books back then were cash grabs. And that, I think, makes a pretty good segue to our first list, the top 5 worst licensed books I've ever had the misfortune of reading. Number 5, The Adventures of Bob Hope, Alan Ladd, Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis, Pat Boone, etc. To clarify, these are not all one title. It's just the way they are written, they might as well have been. I've only read a handful of these comics. They're not easy to come by, at least cheap. And at best, these stories are silly, cringeworthy, and pointless. It's not the silliness that bothers me. The pointlessness and stupidity, on the other hand, get a bit grating. The worst part about these celebrity exploitation comics is that you can plug any celebrity into them, and they make about as much sense. To prove it, DC kept The Adventures of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis going after Martin and Lewis broke up as a comedy duo. But that's not even the weirdest thing. Some of these books lasted a really long time. Bob Hope lasted for 109 issues over the course of 18 years. The Adventures of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis ran for 40 issues, with the series continuing as The Adventures of Jerry Lewis from number 41 to number 124. Weirder still, DC characters would appear in some of these comics. You'd think DC would have erased these events during Crisis. Nope. Some of the original characters created for those series, like Bob Hope's fictional nephew Superhip, appeared as recently as 2009. How the f*** does that happen? And my big question is, in the 50s, what was the audience overlap between, say, a Bob Hope or Jerry Lewis fan and a comic book reader? Because I just don't see it. On a final note, I was surprised that DC never did an Adventures of Little Richard comic. I'm talking Mandela effect level surprised. I was 90% sure that not only did a Little Richard comic exist, but all the Pat Boone comics were just those stories remade for a white audience. Number 4, Police Academy the series, the comic. It's 1989. You want to make a new cartoon, but you're too lazy to create a new character yourself. So what do? How about take an R-rated film franchise and turn it into a family-friendly cartoon? At least I'll give Police Academy one thing. Most of the sequels were PG-13 or even PG rated. So it's not like Rambo or Toxic Avenger where they were straight up making an R-rated franchise into a kid's cartoon. But it's still kinda weird. The cartoon tones down the sex jokes and ups the slapstick. Instead of getting realistic big-time criminals, they got sort of goofy, cartoonish, Dick Tracy-style mobsters and mad scientists. The cartoon was produced by Warner Brothers. Warner owns their own comic book company. But apparently DC Comics wanted nothing to do with this train wreck. So imagine you're Marvel. Someone from Warner Brothers comes up to you and says, "Hey, do you want to turn this new cartoon of ours into a comic?" Shouldn't the fact their own in-house publisher said no way in hell be an indicator that this might not be the best idea? On the other hand, Star did have a better reputation for good-ish licensed books for kids. But still, Star wasn't doing too well at this point. If it weren't for Alf and Heathcliff, they'd be done for. And Marvel has never met a cartoon or toy line that it could say no to. Oh, and did I mention this show had action figures? They did, but they kinda sucked. Well, apart from that mail-order exclusive Tackleberry, that was cool. I liked the show and the comic at the time, but I was 9 years old, and we all know 9-year-olds are stupid. Number 3, Alf. Nothing is more 80s than Alf, and I loved that show as a kid. I'd even watch it for years in endless syndicated reruns, even when there were a half dozen Alf clones on other channels. And I remember hating the animated series set on Melmac, which is why this comic series was sort of a mixed bag. You got a mix of comics with caricatures of a live-action cast and Archie-esque gag strips, and stories set on Melmac. The biggest problem for me, even at the time, was sticking to that sort of humor anthology format. If they wanted to be more like the show, they would have done one 32-page story and kept it funny. But no, most of the time that we got a story that was more than 16 pages, it was a Melmac story. And well, I've already stated my opinion on those. The worst part for me is that there is a Marvel Universe crossover set during the Evolutionary War. That's right, Melmac exists in the Marvel Universe. Deal with it. To me, a huge question is, how the hell did this book continue a year after the TV show went off the air? Can someone explain that to me? Please, please. Number 2, Married with Children, the comic. This show is a crass, crude, and offensive sitcom that became the template for almost every sitcom to ever air on the Fox network. You can see echoes of it even today in Last Man Standing and Family Guy. My question is, how do you take a series like that and turn it into a comic book in 1990? I mean, you need a Comics Code approved stamp just to sell it on most newsstands. The answer is, you can't. This comic series barely had anything to do with the show. While Al and Peg traded insults, it tended to lack the barb of the show. If the show was a verbal AK-47, the comic was a Nerf gun. To be more bizarre, it featured Star Wars parodies and the Bundys as superheroes. There was an issue where Al was abducted by aliens. It feels less like a Married with Children comic book and more like Archie with fart jokes. Which, come to think of it, could be a really cool concept if you didn't call it Married with Children. Number 1, the Nintendo Comic System. This isn't a single title. This is another whole line of comics. It consisted of Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, Punch-Out, Metroid, Game Boy, and Captain N the Game Master. And these comics were all sorts of awful. The scripts were nonsense, the art was god-awful, the coloring looked like somebody vomited on the page. I was reading mostly kids' comics in 1989 to 1990. What I remember being the biggest insult, even at the time, was the price. Valiant expected kids to shell out $1.50 for this stuff. This was at a time where an Archie or Disney comic was $1, and even most DC and Marvel stuff was $1.25. But nope, Nintendo comics, $1.50. And these comics weren't even really comics. They were Nintendo ads. No effort was made whatsoever to make them anything else. At least Captain N pretended to have a story when it was on TV. But here, they were expecting kids to shell out their allowance to buy a Nintendo ad that had inside it other Nintendo ads. Just thinking about it makes me just mad. Just smash. We now return to our show, already in progress. Number 10, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Adventures. This comic series published by Archie Comics was weird. Like a lot of toy-based comics at the time, the early issues simply adapted episodes of the TV series. However, by the third or fourth issue of the second series, Archie, along with Eastman and Laird, said, "You're a little bit behind on that, so screw it, just do new material." Eastman and Laird were okay with this, as long as they could take a more direct hand in things. If by a direct hand you mean they talked to their buddy Stephen Murphy and said, "Here, take this, do whatever the hell you want as long as it's family friendly." Murphy had a few issues with this. For one thing, he was doing a mature reader's book at an independent publisher. He didn't want kids seeing his name on the cover and thinking it was anything like his TMNT work. Second, he was doing some rather dark turtle stories at Mirage. He didn't want his reputation taking a hit because he was doing kiddie work. Then he came up with the pseudonym Dean Clarrain, and all was right with the world. He proceeded to do parodies of pro wrestling. He talked about environmental themes. He discussed labor conditions in South America, the dangers of excess capitalism, the US military's actions in Japan during World War II, the problem with Chinese rule of Tibet, the roots of the Middle East conflict, and a time travel story about a post-apocalyptic future brought about by severe, uncontrolled climate change. It was a series that talked down to kids as little as possible. But by 1995, the Turtles fad was dying. Then Stephen Murphy announced that his final arc was going to have Future Shredder create a cyborg clone body for the brain of Adolf Hitler. He wanted to use it as a vehicle to teach kids about World War II. I know what you're going to say. What the fuck was he thinking? But to this day, this is still my favorite incarnation of the Turtles. It was my favorite comic when I was 9 to 13, and rereading it now, I still love it. Number 9, G.I. Joe, The Marvel Years. I'm not one for war comics, and I haven't read every issue of this series, but what I have seen is really good. Better than any comic book designed to sell action figures has a right to be, which is probably why it lasted for 12 years. The main reason the sales on this series are said to have dropped are twofold. The first being Hasbro revamping the toy line, and the second is Hasbro taking the show out of syndication. It left G.I. Joe sort of a ghost franchise with no support. What makes the comics great is that they showed more of each individual character, treated them like people. and they were allowed to be more violent. Which, makes sense if you're doing a book about a Black Ops team. Plus, Cobra was shown to not be a very stable organization. We had members fighting each other almost as much as they fought the Joes. And that made it a lot more interesting. Number 8, Godzilla Volume 1. I love giant monster movies. I know most of them are stupid, but I love them anyway. So it makes sense that I would love a Godzilla comic. But what really makes this series cool was that Marvel's lawyers were really smart. This wasn't just an adaptation of a Godzilla movie. This was new Godzilla stuff. And Marvel was allowed to use their own characters in it. Not only that, Toho was unaware that it was not standard practice for the comic company to own any original characters in the series. So, hypothetically, if Marvel introduced a villain named Dr. Diamoniacus in their series, he could later go on to fight the Shogun Warriors, and then later hassle the West Coast Avengers. And that's not just a string of words I said, that's something that actually happened. This meant that King of the Monsters could have a serious impact on the Marvel Universe. It gave his atomic fire breath the oomph it deserved. What's really odd is that you'd expect Godzilla's most interesting fight to be with people like Thor or the Hulk, but no. The coolest fights that Godzilla got into in the Marvel Universe were Godzilla vs. Ant-Man and Godzilla vs. Devil Dinosaur. Not exactly what you would call A-list Marvel heroes. Number 7, Pluto. I'm not even sure this one counts. Naoki Urasawa, creator of the masterful 20th Century Boys manga, is telling an Astro Boy story. Sort of. It's Astro Boy characters done in Urasawa's style. And it's not a direct Astro Boy riff either. It's a reimagining of Tezuka's characters as a noir detective story. I know that sounds stupid, but this series never seems like a cynical cash grab. The original Astro Boy is a fun and breezy story that occasionally tries to comment on the specter of the Cold War in the 50s and 60s. Whereas Pluto is a murder mystery that uses the same world to tell a story about the endless war on terror and comments on civil rights issues. It's well worth checking out. Number 6, Scooby-Doo Apocalypse. This is the first of many of those DC Hanna-Barbera reimaginings to make this list. Scooby-Doo Apocalypse is insane. First, you take the Scooby-Doo characters. Then you make them hate each other when they first meet. Add real zombies, and half the population turned into monsters. Add an X-Files type conspiracy that Velma and Shaggy might have been working for, thinking they were in it for the betterment of humanity and animal kind. Mix in some Walking Dead and George Romero, then add a pinch of the humor of Keith Giffen and the spiritual beliefs of J.M. DeMatteis, and the result is, well, the results speak for themselves. Plus, near the end of the run, you've got some great Secret Squirrel and Atom Ant backup comics. Number 5, Star Trek The Early Voyages. Before the second season of Star Trek Discovery, fans had little to no information about Captain Christopher Pike, other than he was captain of the Enterprise before James T. Kirk. Marvel's licensing arrangement with Paramount was a little bit looser than the one DC had suffered under. They were allowed to do Star Trek comics that weren't based on a particular TV series. They saw fans' demand for Adventures of Christopher Pike, and they set out to fill it. They answered the question, who is Pike? What sort of things did he do? How did he become a legendary captain? And his crew was not Kirk's crew by any means. Yes, it had the same tone as Star Trek the original series, but it didn't have that same the mission's over, so forget about all this mentality. So it combined all the things that made the original series great with the scale of Deep Space Nine. Discovery might have made some of these stories moot, but they're still quite entertaining. Number 4, The Flintstones. Here is another one of those great DC Hanna-Barbera reimaginings I was talking about. Don't look at me like that. We all knew this one was coming. Come on, this is me. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live in a universe where the Flintstones was actually funny? And I don't mean just ha-ha funny. I mean roll on the floor laughing your ass off funny. That's what Mark Russell gives us. It still has a lot of those sitcom-y tropes that the Flintstones was known for. But if the original Flintstones was the Honeymooners, this is more Arrested Development or My Name is Earl. It's using these characters and concepts to comment on the best and worst of humanity. Instead of getting the umpteenth reiteration of the Battle of the Sexes that the Flintstones were known for in the 60s, and we all got sick of, we get stories that subtly address gay marriage, freedom of religion, and the need for rules of engagement in war. Not only that, but this book pulls off a miracle. After more than 50 years, it has made the worst character in the franchise, the Great Falcon Gazoo, into an amazing character. Number 3, Star Trek Starfleet Academy. As I said, when Marvel got the Star Trek license in the 90s, they did some interesting things with it, at least in their titles that weren't based on a particular TV series. This gave them a little bit more wiggle room of what they could do, since they didn't have to keep their characters intact or reset to some sort of corporate mandated status quo because stories were set between episodes. Unlike Star Trek The Early Voyages, which had to keep some of their main cast intact so they would be where they needed to be in the episode The Menagerie, Starfleet Academy was set at the same time as the Voyager and Deep Space Nine episodes of the 1996 through 1998 TV seasons. So that meant they didn't have that restriction, which gave the series a lot more urgency. Apart from Nog, all the characters, not just a few of them, were in real jeopardy. After using the first few issues to lull the readers into a false sense of security, the series goes all DS9 and puts the characters through absolute hell, which is the last thing you'd expect from a Star Trek comic, especially one about up-and-coming cadets. But it was sort of what Star Trek comics need. Number 2, Exit Stage Left: The Snagglepuss Chronicles. One of these things is not like the other. Insightful, inspiring, politically relevant, biting satire, and Hanna-Barbera. Well, at least that was true up until now. Mark Russell does everything he did on the Flintstones with the core Hanna-Barbera characters: Snagglepuss, Huckleberry Hound, Augie Doggy, Doggy Daddy, Yogi Bear. He reveals something people have joked about for decades, that Snagglepuss is gay. But instead of playing it for laughs, he set the story right around the time the cartoons were starting in the mid-1950s. In case you didn't know, that wasn't exactly the best time to be a homosexual with socialist leanings. Of course, much like Arthur Miller was using The Crucible to talk about McCarthy, Russell is using McCarthy to talk about a certain orange elephant in the room. It uses the Hanna-Barbera characters as a way to say things that maybe you couldn't say in an ordinary comic, or at least make them relatable and understandable to an audience that might not otherwise be receptive to it. That's what makes this comic so amazing. Number 1, Disney's Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck by Carl Barks. Now, I'm not saying all Donald Duck comics are great. There are a lot of Donald Duck comics out there. Some are really good. Some are middling. But the Duck stuff by Carl Barks isn't just an achievement in terms of licensed comics, they're great comics, period. They capture the look and feel of a Disney cartoon to a T. I don't think it would surprise anyone to find out that Carl Barks worked as a Disney animator before he came to work for Western, Dell, and Gold Key. Barks pitched and wrote crazy stories that didn't just go for gags. He treated the Ducks like people. It is reported that many writers and artists didn't like working on Disney comics because of the amount of feedback they would get from Disney management. Carl Barks didn't get half as many of these notes as anyone else. Some speculate that this is because Roy W. Disney was a personal friend of his. Letters from the Disney archive dispute this. There are correspondences between Walt Disney and Barks that seem to indicate that Barks didn't get as much feedback because he knew Walt, not just in that worked together in the trenches sort of way. Barks knew what Disney wanted comics featuring his characters to be. He tried his damnedest to always deliver that. He would sit on stories for weeks or even months before turning them in, because he knew Disney was a perfectionist. But if there was anyone who was an even bigger perfectionist than Walt Disney, it was Carl Barks. One of the first things you'll notice about a Carl Barks Duck story is that there's a lot more of an adventure element than in the standard Disney cartoon. In a way, these comics were ahead of their time. They inspired not only the opening scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark, but a cartoon series that most 80s and 90s kids remember quite fondly, DuckTales. Well folks, this is it. The end of Comic Book Corner. Or is it? Leave a comment and let me know. This is as far as I had planned, but you never know. Okay, it's me blathering over the credits time, and yes, I'm aware the worst list wasn't the worst licensed books out there, it's just the worst ones I've read. And yes, I'm aware The Great Gazoo had its own comic. It lasted 20 issues from 1973 to 1977. I didn't include it because I've never read it. I've asked my local comic book shop if they had any, and they have practically everything, but not that. But I kind of want to see one. Maybe I should have included Kooshkins on there. You know, those koosh balls with stupid comical faces put on them? But I was torn between that and DC's Celebrity line, and the latter seemed even more inexplicable. As for the best list, I've heard good things about Dynamite's take on Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys, done as sort of a noir thriller. I even ordered the first trade at my local comic book store. I'm just waiting for it to come in. The only other really good licensed book that I didn't include was the Archie Goodman and Walter Simonson run on Star Wars.